You know what's strange about silence? When you stop texting her and she stops texting you, it feels like nothing is happening. No messages, no signals, no confirmation. And in that quiet, the mind jumps to one conclusion: it's over. But that's the illusion. Because silence isn't the absence of emotion, it's the moment emotion stops being distracted and finally reveals itself. When communication ends, the game doesn't stop. It changes form. In noise, people perform. They explain, chase, reassure, and negotiate their worth. But in silence, there's nowhere to hide. No words to lean on. No validation to borrow. What remains is truth. And here's the part most people don't understand. When two people go quiet, they don't experience that silence the same way. One begins to reflect. The other begins to feel unsettled. And the one who can remain calm in that quiet, that person holds the emotional center. Modern relationships are built on constant contact. Notifications, updates, instant replies. We've been conditioned to believe that attention equals connection, so when the attention stops, anxiety rushes in. The urge to do something becomes overwhelming, but silence isn't asking you to react. It's asking you to observe. This is where power quietly shifts, not through control, not through manipulation, but through emotional restraint. Because the man who can sit comfortably in silence isn't losing control, he's reclaiming it. And if you stay with me, you'll begin to understand why silence, handled correctly, speaks louder than any message you could ever send. Modern relationships are not built on depth, they're built on noise. Constant texting, instant replies, stories, likes, reactions, and endless digital signals that say, "I'm here, see me, don't forget me." Over time, we confuse visibility with value and attention with connection. That's why silence feels so uncomfortable. Silence removes the distractions that keep emotions numb. It cuts through the constant stimulation and exposes what's really there, or what isn't. When the messages stop, there's no feed to scroll, no reassurance to lean on, no quick hit of validation to calm the mind. And that's terrifying for most people. We've been conditioned to believe that if someone isn't constantly communicating, they're losing interest, but the truth is, constant communication often hides emotional insecurity. It keeps people from sitting with uncertainty, from facing their own attachment, and from understanding their real emotional position. Silence does the opposite. It creates a void where attention used to live, and that void demands honesty. You can't mask insecurity with emojis. You can't maintain illusion with good morning texts. You're forced to confront what the connection actually meant, without filters, without performance. That's why silence feels threatening. Not because it ends relationships, but because it reveals them. In silence, you don't get to distract yourself with hope or fear. You simply observe. And observation is dangerous to illusion, but essential to truth. This is why silence is powerful. It doesn't lie. Most people misunderstand silence. They think it's a tactic, a punishment, a way to gain control or provoke a reaction. But real silence, intentional, grounded silence, is none of those things. Silence is a mirror. When communication stops, silence reflects your internal state back to you. If you feel calm, it means your sense of self is stable. If you feel restless, anxious, or tempted to reach out, silence hasn't created those emotions, it has simply exposed them. This is where many men get it wrong. They believe silence is something you do to the other person. In reality, silence is something you experience within yourself first. It strips away distraction and forces you to face your attachment, your expectations, and your need for validation. This is where Stoicism enters. The Stoic doesn't suppress emotion. He observes it without being ruled by it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we always have the choice to step back and examine our reactions. Silence creates that space. It pauses impulse and replaces it with awareness. Used this way, silence isn't manipulative, it's honest. There's no begging, no convincing, no performance, just restraint. And restraint is not weakness, it's emotional strength. Silence doesn't attack, it doesn't chase, it simply stands still. And in doing so, it reveals what words often distort: the truth of how much control you really have over yourself. The moment silence begins, an internal conflict starts, and it has nothing to do with her. It happens inside you. On one side is the ego. The ego hates uncertainty. It demands action, reassurance, and control. It whispers, "Send one message, just check in. If you stay quiet, she'll forget you." The ego equates silence with loss and believes worth must be constantly proven. On the other side is peace. Peace doesn't rush, it observes. It understands that what's meant to stay doesn't need to be chased. Peace says, wait, let things settle, let truth rise on its own. This is where most men lose their ground. Silence exposes attachment. With no messages to analyze, the mind starts overworking. Did I say something wrong? Is she talking to someone else? Is this a test? Thoughts multiply because the ego is desperate to regain certainty. But here's the hard truth. Silence isn't testing you. Life is. The urge to reach out isn't love. It's discomfort. And every time you act from that discomfort, you train your mind to believe that peace only exists outside of you. Stoicism teaches something different. You don't eliminate the urge. You outgrow it. You sit with the tension instead of escaping it. And each time you resist the impulse to chase, your emotional center becomes stronger. That's the real battle. Not between you and her, but between ego and self-control. And the man who chooses peace doesn't lose power. He earns it. When communication stops, her experience of silence is different, but just as real. Not because she's calculating or playing a game, but because absence activates reflection in a way presence never does. At first, there's often relief. No pressure to reply, no expectations to manage, no emotional weight. The mind interprets silence as space, and space can feel freeing in the beginning, but silence doesn't stay neutral for long. After a short time, relief turns into curiosity. She begins to notice the absence, not dramatically, subtly. The routine has changed. The familiar energy is missing, and the question forms quietly. Why hasn't he reached out? From curiosity comes doubt. Was the connection deeper than she realized? Did she underestimate his presence? This is where silence becomes loud, not externally, but internally. Because what disappears gains definition. Eventually, that doubt can turn into emotional craving. Not because she suddenly needs attention, but because the mind often recognizes value only after it's removed. What once felt optional now feels uncertain, and uncertainty creates emotional tension. This isn't manipulation, it's psychology. Especially for avoidant tendencies, closeness can feel overwhelming, while distance clarifies desire. When you stop chasing, you stop feeding the ego-driven dynamic. And without that reinforcement, she's left alone with her honest emotional response. Here's the key point most men miss. Silence doesn't convince her of your value. It reveals whether she already felt it. And that truth, whatever it is, emerges far faster and quiet than it ever could through words. Silence is often mistaken for doing nothing. But in reality, silence is one of the most active emotional states you can choose. When you stop reaching out, the emotional dynamic resets. The chasing energy disappears. The constant effort, the explaining, the subtle need for control, all of it dissolves. What remains is balance. Silence shifts power not because it intimidates, but because it stabilizes. Attraction and emotional influence are never fixed. They move depending on who is emotionally centered and who is reacting. The person who can remain still while emotions are unsettled gains clarity, and clarity always outweighs urgency. This is why silence feels uncomfortable at first. It removes motion. It forces both people to sit with reality rather than distraction. But for the one who can stay grounded, silence becomes strength. You're no longer negotiating your worth. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're no longer adjusting yourself to maintain connection. You're simply present with yourself. That presence carries weight, not because it's dramatic, but because it's rare. Most people react. Very few remain composed, and composition is power. Silence isn't withdrawal, it's alignment. It's the decision to stop pouring energy into uncertainty and return it to yourself. And when that happens, emotional balance begins to tilt, naturally, quietly, without force. That's why silence isn't passive. It's controlled energy. Silence doesn't just create space, it reveals intention. When communication stops, many people focus on who texts first as if it's a competition, but that's not the real point. What matters isn't the timing, it's the reason behind the action. If someone genuinely values the connection, your absence will register. Not as panic, but as awareness. They'll feel the shift and reach out naturally, without games or pressure. If someone is driven by validation rather than connection, silence pushes them elsewhere. They seek attention to fill the gap instead of reflection to understand it. This is why silence accelerates truth. Words can mislead, promises can confuse, explanations can delay reality. But behavior during silence is honest. It shows whether the bond was mutual or one-sided, grounded, or conditional. From a Stoic perspective, this is observation without interference. You're not provoking a response. You're allowing reality to unfold without force, and that takes discipline. Because breaking silence too early often comes from discomfort, not intention. It's an attempt to escape uncertainty rather than face it. The person who waits isn't cold, they're composed. They understand that clarity doesn't come from chasing answers. It comes from allowing actions to speak, and in silence actions are loud. One of the hardest parts of silence is the craving for closure. The mind wants answers, it wants explanations, reassurance, and final words that make everything make sense. That desire is human, but it's also misleading. Most people believe closure comes from one last conversation, one final message that clears the confusion, but real closure doesn't come from dialogue. It comes from acceptance. Stoicism teaches that peace is not found in controlling outcomes, but in controlling responses. If someone truly values you, your absence will speak more clearly than any explanation ever could. And if they don't, no amount of talking will change that reality. Silence removes false hope. It forces you to stop waiting for words that may never arrive and start listening to what's already being shown. Effort, initiative, presence, or the lack of it. This is where emotional maturity is tested. You don't need to remind anyone of your worth. You don't need to argue your importance. You don't need to chase understanding. Acceptance isn't giving up. It's seeing clearly. It's recognizing that what is meant to stay doesn't require persuasion. When you stop seeking closure from others, you reclaim it within yourself, and that internal closure is stable. No message can take it away. That's freedom. Many people feel guilty for choosing silence. They worry it looks cold, immature, or manipulative. But silence, when rooted in self-respect, is none of those things. Silence is preservation. It's the decision to stop overextending yourself emotionally, to stop explaining your value to someone who has already seen it but chooses not to engage with it. You're not ignoring them to cause pain. You're protecting your peace. Punishment comes from resentment. Silence comes from clarity. When you step back, you're not trying to teach anyone a lesson. You're teaching yourself one, that your energy is valuable and not everyone deserves constant access to it. This shift is powerful because it restores boundaries. You stop reacting to mixed signals. You stop filling gaps that aren't yours to fill. You stop chasing reciprocity. And in that restraint, your sense of self strengthens. Silence doesn't harden you. It refines you. You learn the difference between connection and attachment, between effort and overinvestment. And once you see that difference, you no longer need to prove anything. You simply choose where your energy belongs. That's not punishment. That's self-respect. Silence is only powerful if you use it correctly, not by waiting, watching, or obsessing, but by redirecting your energy with intention. When communication stops, don't fill that space with anxiety. Fill it with purpose. Start with your body. Physical discipline grounds the mind. Training, movement, and routine release tension and restore confidence. Not to impress anyone, but to remind yourself that strength is built daily, not granted by attention. Sharpen your mind. Read, learn, reflect. Silence is the perfect environment for clarity because there's no emotional noise competing for your focus. Use that quiet to expand your thinking instead of replaying conversations. Invest in your craft. Whatever you're building, your career, a skill, a vision, pour your energy there. Progress creates stability, and stability weakens emotional dependency. Most importantly, resist the impulse to reach out. Each time you pause instead of reacting, you're rewiring your brain. You're teaching it that peace doesn't come from external validation, it comes from self-control. This isn't about distraction, it's about evolution. You're not improving yourself to trigger a reaction. You're rebuilding your center. And when your focus returns to you, something shifts internally. You feel lighter, clearer, more grounded. Silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling productive, and that's when you realize you're no longer waiting for anything. You're moving forward. There comes a moment when silence stops feeling heavy and starts feeling natural. That's when something important shifts, not outside of you, but within you. When your focus returns inward, your energy stabilizes. You're no longer watching your phone, replaying conversations, or measuring your worth by someone else's attention. You're present, grounded, calm. That calm is magnetic. People sense when you're no longer reaching, no longer seeking reassurance. Your silence carries confidence because it isn't forced. It isn't meant to provoke. It simply reflects self-sufficiency. This is where mystery naturally appears. Not manufactured mystery, but the kind that comes from not explaining yourself, not overexposing your emotions, and not narrating your every thought. And mystery fuels attraction, but here's the Stoic distinction that matters most. You don't use silence to get someone back. You use it to get yourself back. Once you stop chasing outcomes, you detach from the need for a specific result, and paradoxically, that's when attention often returns. Not because you demanded it, but because you no longer needed it. At that point, whether she reaches out or not becomes secondary. You've already won something far more valuable: your emotional independence. And independence is always attractive, first to yourself, and then, sometimes, to others. Silence eventually asks a question you can't avoid. When everything goes quiet, what rises inside you? Peace or panic? This is the real test. Not whether she reaches out, not whether the connection resumes, but whether you can sit with yourself without needing external reassurance. If silence feels unbearable, it's not because you're losing someone. It's because something inside you feels unsteady. Dependence hides well in constant communication, but silence exposes it immediately, and that exposure is uncomfortable, but valuable. A grounded man doesn't fear silence because his identity isn't borrowed from attention. He doesn't rush to fill gaps or force outcomes. He understands that needing a response is different from wanting connection. Silence reveals whether you are sharing life or escaping yourself. This isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. Because once you see the truth of your emotional state, you gain the power to change it. You stop reacting blindly and start responding consciously. Most people run from this moment. A Stoic welcomes it. Because silence doesn't weaken you. It shows you exactly where strength needs to be built, and once that strength is built, no delay, no absence, and no rejection can shake your foundation. The Stoics believe that true strength is quiet, not loud, not reactive, not dependent on circumstances outside of your control. Marcus Aurelius wrote that nowhere is a man more at peace than in his own soul. That inner space, calm, ordered, self-contained, is what the Stoics called the inner fortress. And silence is the doorway to it. When messages stop, when replies don't come, when expectations collapse, you're invited inward, not to isolate, but to stabilize, to stop outsourcing your emotional balance to another person. Silence teaches you how to stand alone without feeling lonely. In that stillness, you realize something important. Control was never about getting a response. It was always about governing yourself, your reactions, your impulses, your need to explain. Silence doesn't end stories, it reveals them. It shows you what was real, what was imagined, and what was built on attachment rather than connection. And once you see clearly, you stop fearing outcomes. Because a man who has mastered his inner world cannot be shaken by the outer one. So the next time communication stops, don't panic. Don't chase. Don't negotiate your worth. Stand still. In that stillness, you're not losing control. You're mastering it. And that mastery, that quiet strength, is where your transformation begins. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on it, not emotionally, but honestly. Silence has a way of revealing truths we often avoid, and awareness is the first step towards strength. This channel isn't about chasing attention or playing games. It's about emotional discipline, self-respect, and becoming grounded in who you are, regardless of who stays or leaves. If you believe more men need to hear this perspective, share it with someone who might be struggling in silence right now. Sometimes clarity arrives through the right words at the right moment, and if you want more content on Stoicism, emotional control, and modern relationship psychology, subscribe to the channel. Not for motivation, but for mastery. Remember this: silence isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of your transformation. Stay centered, stay disciplined, and let silence do its work.